The Soul Redeemer, Chapter 7, Beginnings. It was not long after the family holiday that the greatest battle for Nicole's life began. Actually, it had begun on the day she was born, as Lord I.S., who had closely been watching David's bloodline, encountered the holy angel Cantor at her birth. For I.S., Cantor's presence was confirmation that this was the one that carried the mark of God's plan for the destruction of Satan's purposes in David's bloodline. The two angels, one dark, one light, looked at each other with understanding in their eyes. There was no need for words, for the two who had known each other as friends long ago before the world was created and before the war had divided them, now understood the plans and purposes of the other. Cantor held no bitterness toward I.S., for there was no bitterness in the kingdom of love. However, he could not help but feel the sadness that still pricked his heart upon seeing the one he had once called brother, but who had chosen to reject Yahweh and to align himself with the adversary. He nodded at his opponent in recognition of him personally, recognition of their conflicting purposes in being there, and recognition of the battle they were facing. If I.S. felt any nostalgia, he did not let it show. His eyes remained dark and fierce, yet he nodded in return at Cantor, a nod that declared, "Let the battle begin." The two warriors were well matched in knowledge, strength, and purpose. Incubus Succubus was as perverted and unholy as Cantor was holy and righteous. They were both high-ranking officials in opposite warring kingdoms. Both were equally and totally committed to serving their masters, and both had access to armies under them who would respond upon command. The admonition God had given David to pray for his granddaughter was the precursor to the next phase of Nicole's life, as the heat of the battle was increased beyond measure. I.S. felt an urgency to step up his plan. He had decided that one bloodline was not enough to carry the responsibility of this important case, and was very pleased to find upon examination that the father side would be able to not only help, but would most likely seal the deal. Marcus was Nicole's great-uncle on her father's side. He was not of her blood, but he had married into the family. He was a Freemason of the 33rd degree in the Scottish Rite. Masons were a secret society, and it was not commonly known even to those in the lower degrees that they were Luciferians, Satan worshippers with connections to the Illuminati. Having served a term in the U.S. Senate, Marcus had become familiar with those high-ranking government officials, of which there were many, who were also involved themselves in the same agenda and pursuits connected with what they referred to as the New World Order. After leaving office, he had continued his involvement in this more secret side of his political associations. Because Marcus was a master of the highest degree within the Masons, he was also Master Chief of the Satanic Covens in the district. Marcus was quite familiar with I.S., for on many occasions during satanic rituals, Marcus would allow and even invite this principality to use his body to accomplish his purposes. So when I.S. came to Marcus and presented his plan, he readily agreed to help. I.S. warned Marcus to be on his guard and explained that in David's bloodline, Nicole had been chosen to be the host for I.S. himself, as the times were pointing toward the fulfillment of the great plan. However, their arch-enemy had chosen her as well to be set apart in that kingdom for his purposes. Marcus loved a challenge. It was not too great a surprise when Marcus received a phone call from Capitol Hill the following morning. "Marcus, I had a visitor last night. I know that he has given you a very important assignment, and I want to know specifically what he told you." Marcus sighed. He wished that for once they would just trust him. "Well, sir, I know that she is a chosen one, and that I am to prepare her for the role she will be assuming. I already have a plan in place, and am working on the details even as we speak." "Very good, Marcus," came the reply. "I'm assuming that you understand fully the importance of this assignment." Her DNA has been prepared specifically for this position over generations, and we can't risk failure at this late date." "Yes, sir. I understand the magnitude and ramification of this specific assignment. I can assure you that I will personally see to it that all the bases are covered. I won't fail you or the Brotherhood, sir," Marcus replied. The voice on the other end of the line responded, "See that you don't." After a slight pause, he continued, "I'm assuming that you were also informed of the other's interest in her as well." "Yes, sir, I do understand that side of the issue, and I'm sure I can work around that." "Very well. Carry on, Marcus." "I will, sir. Good day." Marcus initiated his preparations by suggesting to his wife that they invite her grandnephew's family over for dinner. They were relatively new to the area, and he explained he would enjoy having the family around. That was the beginning of Nicole's introduction to Marcus, and he made sure that she loved to come to his house. They had TV and a swimming pool. He made sure that he paid just the right amount of attention to her so that she would feel comfortable with him, yet not so much that anyone would suspect him of foul play. He made sure that his teenage daughter was available to babysit Nicole at their house, then conveniently arranged for his wife and daughter to have to leave while she was there, volunteering to babysit until they got back. He discovered that Nicole would be an easy target because she already had great dissociative abilities as well as a premature sense of spiritual insight. He would have no problem setting up barriers in her mind to block her memories of this time with her in their home, and later at the ritual. She was also at exactly the right age, 4 years old enough to understand certain things, but young enough to be able to mold her mind, to create programming so that she could be controlled. Most 4-year-old minds, not brains, were blank slates, and they were spiritually vulnerable as well, which made it easy to layer in demons that would work with the programming to accomplish their purposes. In Nicole's case, she had been dedicated to their God by her dedication by her parents. Her spiritual covering had essentially claimed her for their side until her age of accountability, when she would be responsible for making the choice herself. But Marcus understood the power of the human will and was experienced in understanding ways of working around that small problem. It wasn't difficult to locate a woman in the occult and assign her the job of winning the trust of Nicole's parents so that she was allowed the privilege of spending a day alone with her. The plan worked out more easily than Marcus had imagined. While he groomed and prepared Nicole mentally, emotionally, and physically, Carol was faithfully attending church with Nicole's family. After about a month, she deceptively played her hand, asking if she might spend the day with Nicole, taking her shopping and such, since she didn't have a child of her own. Nicole's parents had no idea that this was a bogus shopping trip or a dangerous situation for their daughter, and they were delighted that they could share Nicole with this woman. Nicole was excited because she had been dreaming of pink high-heeled shoes that she had seen in the toy section at her local department store, but until now she had had no hope of ever owning them. In Nicole's way of thinking, if this woman wanted to take her shopping, she would be sure to let her know exactly what they were shopping for. And then the day came. Nicole was full of hopeful expectations. She excitedly chattered about the shoes she wanted as they drove along, and was unsure what to think about Carol's sudden silence and emotional distance. When they pulled up at a large apartment building instead of a department store, Carol explained that shopping would have to wait until later. They went inside and descended into the basement. Nicole became uneasy and pressed in close to Carol, who pushed her away. Another woman came and knelt down in front of Nicole and began to talk nicely to her, comforting her. The nice woman gave her some Kool-Aid to drink. But soon after that, Nicole began to feel very strange. She suddenly didn't care about pink high heels, and she began to cry, asking if she could please go home now. A man called a doctor, took her into a room to examine her. He laid her on a bed, and her body seemed to go to sleep. She could hear him, but was unable to respond to anything the doctor told her to do. Nicole was aware of another man standing in the doorway. She could hear the doctor talking to him, and there was something familiar about his voice. Uncle Marcus? Was he here to help her? She tried to call out to him, but couldn't. Nicole heard the doctor say, "She'll be okay, but we won't be able to do anything with her when she's like this. She has no tolerance for drugs." The other man responded that they would just have to wait for another day then. Uncle Marcus's voice was strangely comforting and disquieting at the same time. Why didn't he acknowledge her? Marcus was frustrated with this turn of events. The gravity of this case was weighing heavily on him, and he was ready to have this assignment over and done with. And then there was the frustration of working with the inferior, less experienced covens that irritated him. He preferred to worship his master with others of his own rank and caliber, and rarely involved himself directly with those in the lower echelons. Nicole must have slept, for some time later she awakened as the nice lady was shaking her, telling her it was time to wake up. Nicole opened her eyes and sat up with help. Her body felt very heavy. The lady gave her some water to drink and some bread. Nicole had to go to the bathroom, and the lady told her where to go. She looked up at the narrow, dirty staircase, and as she began to climb, she felt more and more uncomfortable. Looking back at the lady, she asked if she would come with her, but the lady told her that she would be fine. Nicole reached the top of the stairs and turned to the left. The bathroom door was slightly open, and in the dim light she saw that it was small and dirty. She was afraid to go in, but because of her need, she pushed the door open wider and entered. Upon entering, Nicole gasped in disbelief as she gazed upon a tiny, naked, dead baby in the basket. At first she thought it was a doll, but she reached down and picked it up. It was soft and looked broken. It was not a doll. She dropped the baby and screamed for help. She could no longer control her bladder and wet her panties. She began descending the steep staircase as quickly as she could in her panicked state. The people in the room were just standing there, staring at her in eerie silence as she cried and begged them to help the baby. The doctor man tightly took hold of her arms. It hurt, and Nicole began to frantically thrash about, trying to escape his grip, but he held her more tightly, confining her arms and legs until in exhaustion she calmed down. In a quiet but authoritative voice, the doctor said, "Nicole, the baby is dead. You are not to tell anybody about the baby or anything else you have seen or heard here today, or that you were even here. In fact, you will not even remember that you were here. You see, we killed that baby, and we will kill your family if you tell. Do you understand?" Nicole's disassociative abilities readily kicked in, and the memories of the baby and the emotions associated with it were immediately filed away behind thick walls in her mind. And yet the importance that she was not to tell stayed with her in her subconscious. They made sure that any memories of the day were buried as well, especially those concerning Marcus. They placed the suggestion of shame in her mind for wetting her underpants, and then gave her clean ones. She heard the doctor tell Carol to take her shopping after all, that it would pave the way for her to gain other days with Nicole. Nicole got her pink high heels, but somehow they did not bring her the joy that she thought they would. Nicole didn't know how she knew, but she did know that she needed help. She couldn't explain why, and she knew that even if she could, she would not, because that would be bad. But she felt desperate for help. That was when something unexpected happened that neither Marcus nor Ayas had anticipated. Nicole remembered her daddy had told her that God could help people. So she told her daddy that she wanted Jesus to come into her heart. He asked her if she knew what that meant, and she said that she did, that she needed Jesus to help her. He asked what she needed help with, and she replied, she just needed help. So he led her in a prayer asking Jesus to come into her heart, to live inside her, to help her. The following week, when Nicole's mommy told her that Carol was going to pick her up again for the day, Nicole begged not to have to go, but Mommy and Daddy thought it was a very nice thing to share their daughter with this thoughtful woman and didn't understand her plea. Nicole couldn't explain because she felt she had to protect her parents from the bad people, and she finally accepted the fact that she would be going with Carol again. This time, Marcus arranged for the ritual to be in a place of higher privilege. In some ways, he was honored that he had been contacted by several members of the Illuminati. They had heard about this serious case and desired to be a part of it. The fact that the child would be given no drugs had added to the novelty of the situation, for few would be able to survive mentally and emotionally under such duress. But Marcus thought that it was probably the rumors of a prophecy in connection with Nicole that had drawn their attention. From the moment Nicole entered the room, dissociation kicked in, and she was no longer Nicole, but little Nikki. The goal was to inseminate Nicole with the spiritual seeds of IS that would grow to be sexual immorality, defilement, evil passions and desires, anarchy and rebellion against the High One and any under his authority, and ultimately the destruction of them. Nicole had been marked as a leader and a warrior, and after being raised within the despised church and gaining respect as one of their leaders, in the fullness of her time, when the seeds were mature, she would host Ias himself and would lead a rebellion within the Christian community, recruiting members from among their own, wreaking spiritual, emotional, mental, and physical havoc and destruction in her wake. Nicole would be one of many who had been targeted, trained, and planted with the purpose of destroying God's kingdom, aborting his coming rule and reign on earth, and ushering in the rule of their true lord Satan. But of course she would need to be united in unholy matrimony with Satan and his kingdom. So they set about preparing her with unholy communion and unholy baptism. These words were familiar to Nikki, and even though she didn't have a clear understanding of those things, she did know this was bad. After baptizing her in urine and feces, they explained that flesh and blood were necessary for her communion. Nikki heard two things. She heard classical music, and she heard the baby crying. She turned and saw the tiny little thing lying naked alone on the table. Maternal instincts kicked in, and she started towards the table to comfort the frightened baby. As she reached down to pick it up, a hand stopped her. Suddenly, the doctor began touching the baby in places she shouldn't be touched, and then people with needles were sticking her, causing the poor baby to cry out in tormenting pain. Nikki could not see the person to whom the restricting hand belonged, and she was unable to recognize the voice that whispered closely in her ear, telling her to pick up the large knife that was on the table next to the baby. The table, which stood on top of a large circle with a star inside of it, was now surrounded by the people. There was total silence in the room, except for the music and the cries of the baby. Nikki was beginning to be greatly fearful for the baby, and she refused to pick up the knife. She closed her eyes and clenched her fists tightly. The man behind her took her right hand and forced her hand open, forced her to pick up the knife, placed both of her hands around the handle, and held them tightly there with his own hands wrapped around hers. Then he lifted them up in the air, and as he brought them down forcefully upon the baby's heart, he shouted, "In the name of Satan!" The baby's cries stopped suddenly. The voice of the man behind her whispered into her ear again, but she was barely able to comprehend his words. He was praising her for providing the blood and the flesh, welcoming her into their sect, for she was one of them now. All Nikki knew was that she had done a terrible thing. She had killed a baby. When the man released her, she fell into a heap on the floor. Tears of remorse and shame silently flowed from the depths of her soul, and there was none to comfort her. They left her on the floor for several minutes, and then someone picked her up and set her on a table. The music played on. It was now time for communion. The blood had been drained. They set the dead baby on the table next to Nicole. The body was cut, and they offered her a piece of flesh. She refused it. In an angry voice, a man asked if she would rather have her meat cooked. There happened to be a fire in the fireplace. They threw the baby into the fire. Nicky knew the baby was dead, and yet the effect that act had upon her was devastating. The smell of burning flesh permeated her nostrils and wouldn't leave. It wasn't in the fire very long. They pulled it out. The poor blackened baby. He cut into the flesh again a small piece and forced it into Nicole's mouth. The feel of it in her mouth caused Nicky to retch, and she threw up. She was severely reprimanded. Another piece was forced down her throat, and somehow she was able to keep it down. And then she was offered a cup from which she drank the warm red liquid. As the people feasted on the baby's flesh and blood, the climate in the room began to change. The music grew louder as the people started dancing and chanting things she didn't understand in words, but in her spirit she knew they were bad. She didn't see the dark angels, but the people were calling them, and she knew they were there. She could sense the evil in the room growing by the second. She was searching for help and felt abandoned by Jesus. This was a wicked place, and she knew that he would not be in a place like this. The truth was that Cantor had never left her side, but he was prevented from interfering or from comforting Nicole with anything other than a thin shield of peace that was able to block some of the evil impact upon her soul. He was cloaked, and not even the other demons knew of his presence. He had learned not to question Yahweh, for his ways were of the highest, and Cantor trusted him implicitly. But that didn't make it easy for him to bear the pain with this precious one.